before I go any further, I do want to make mention the RSVP Awards Luncheon that we will have afterwards. Again, if you've RSVP, it'll be a seated lunch. You can stay where you are. If you haven't, please see myself or Audria. But it is RSVP, and hopefully when you registered, you were able to do so. So we'll have our awards luncheon immediately following this panel. So I want to first thank our panel sponsors, the Indiana HBPA, the Pennsylvania HBPA, and the Thoroughbred Racing Association of Oklahoma for helping us put this great panel together. So HISA, it's that new four-letter word that has been giving us all a lot of uncertainty. Lack of transparency? Maybe. Fear of unknown costs? Maybe. Lack of expertise in writing the rules? Maybe. Certainly gives us a lot of cause for uncertainty. But recently I listened to a podcast. There was a prominent owner, also a Jockey Club member, who was interviewed. It doesn't matter really who he is, but he had some interesting things to say. He called me personally out by name, which I don't mind at all. I stand for everything that we stand for and that we've been putting out with our concerns for HISA for 6 years. Actually, before I was in this seat, when I was a board of trustee member for TOBA, Ken Ramsey and myself were the only ones that voted no for TOBA to support HISA at the time, and that was 2015. But this owner said that I, Eric, was really way off base. Way off base in our concerns. So I've become one to try to develop questions in the responses. So, we want transparency. Is that off base? We don't have any. We want to know what it's going to cost. Horsemen, states, even the track. We have concerns. We don't know. We know what's been turned into the FTC is an allocation, a funding mechanism that I'm sure Ed will speak on more clearly, but as an example, and I don't want to be quoted, but I believe the figure for an Oakmont Park is just over $37,000 per $1 million of the HISA budget. So if it's $10 million, 37 times 10. If it's $150 million, 37 times $150 million. We don't know what their budget is. And we also know, pretty frankly, that whatever budget they turn in the very near future is not going to be the anti-doping and medication control program figures in there. I think we've pretty much been told that. We wanted a seat when writing the rules, and I think everyone in this room knows we had none. The HBPA wants equal representation. We're not trying to run the show, but we certainly got run out of the room. So who's way off base? In my opinion, they just don't want us playing their game. So remember that. It was very interesting to me that this owner referred to us. His quote was, "They should tell us what we want." Immediate segregation. Immediately draws the line. Us and them. Haves, have-nots. However you want to look at it, but they continue to divide the line. So I would ask, if I was given the opportunity to be on a podcast or even have a rebuttal, what is it that is the real problem? Tell me what the real problem is, and let's discuss the solution. I don't think any of us really feel as if we've ever gotten that answer. I think it was said by both Ed Martin and I in front of Congress, the burden of proof is on those trying to push it. Push it being the bill at the time. The statistics don't bear out their allegations. So it's concerning to us. So this owner also said, which I found quite interesting, he said that we, the National HBPA, speak for the lesser tracts. Now guys, I don't know if you've been to the little tract next door called Oakland. Pretty sure I wouldn't call that a lesser tract. So, he also had the audacity to go forward and say, we at the top end need representation also. The last I saw, every HBPA affiliate is democratically an elected board. We don't appoint our members. We don't give them a seat or call them a steward. Membership gets a vote. So we are the majority. Period. And as far as I'm concerned, I'm still trying to find out why many of them have forgotten that the majority rules. And we need to understand why. So, with that, I think we have put together a great panel to discuss HISA and where we are now. And that's, unfortunately, includes a lot of uncertainty. Even proponents of HISA would be honest and say there is uncertainty. And yet July 1st, 2022 is a fixed date. There's no uncertainty in that date. But that's what's in the act, and that's what they say is going to go into play. So we'll see. So we've got a great panel here. I'm happy that Peter Ecabert, the National HBPA General Counsel, has said he would be glad to moderate these guys. And all of you know Peter. Peter's been the legal counsel for the National HBPA for the past 20 years. Most of you don't know that he started when he was 10. So, but Peter's expertise is vast and includes representing tax-exempt organizations, obtaining tax-exempt status, and also representing various non-profit entities. So I'm going to turn it over to Peter and allow him to introduce the panel, and we'll get started, and we will have time, we hope, for questions at the end, unless Ed Martin really gets on a roll.
Thank you, Eric. I want to thank the panel members for taking time out of their busy schedule to participate in this conference in our panel here at Oakland. We all know that we have less than 4 months before this new law that's going to radically just change the regulation of the industry takes effect. And each of these participants, each of our panel members, brings a unique perspective to this discussion. We're happy that they graciously agreed to come and speak about it. The first, introducing the panel member in the middle, Chris Kannady. He's a member of the Oklahoma House of Representatives. Chris is an attorney. He's a Marine Corps veteran, 3 tours in Afghanistan, a tour in Iraq, and a dad of 2 young kids. And Chris will update us on what's going on in the federal case that was filed by the state of Oklahoma and others in challenging the constitutionality of HISA in Lexington, in the federal court in Lexington. You'll also go into some of the other concerns that he has with the act and some of the problems he foresees. Ed Martin, we all know, has extensive experience with the horse racing industry. Ed has previously served as executive director of the New York State Racing and Wagering Board, and he's currently the president and chairman of the board of the ARCI, Association of Racing Commissioners International, where he works for uniformity in racing regulations for North America by way of the model rules, and where his goal is to make the industry strong, honest, safe, and transparent. Ed, as a regulator, brings his perspective to this complex law that is set to take effect in the blink of an eye, the time frame. Pete Sacopulos likewise has extensive experience with equine-related matters. He's an attorney who's represented clients with respect to most every issue that may arise in the business of horse racing. He represented veterinarians, owners, trainers, and track officials. Pete also authored the amicus brief that was filed in the case that the HBPA has pending in the Northern District, the Federal Court of the Northern District of Texas, where Pete represents the North American racetrack veterinarians. And in his brief, Pete addressed the defects in HISA from the standpoint of its violation of due process and for the infringement that HISA makes on the sound practice of veterinary medicine. These panel members' unique perspective will begin, but one of the things I've asked to have passed out, and if you didn't get a copy, just let me know, is sort of a timeline of the activities that have taken place to date. And that's what we'll be getting into more of the specifics, but the timeline sort of goes through some of the things that have come about with HISA. If you notice on that timeline, the first thing where it started out, where HISA was formed, was back in September of 2020. That was when a partner with Ecabert, who's the law firm that represents the authority, filed the certificate of incorporation in Delaware, and then the bylaws were subsequently drafted. We just have seen a copy of those that were finalized, I guess, in September 30th of 2020. It was the HISA bill was passed out of the House without debate, with no formal vote, a voice vote, in September the 29th, and then the nominating committee was selected for HISA, for the authority board. That was done in October of 2020. The Senate passed the HISA bill again without committee hearings and as part of the COVID relief bill in December. It was signed by the President December the 27th and is set, like I say, to go into effect in July of this year. The HBPA filed its lawsuit contesting the constitutionality of HISA in March of 2020, and 2021, excuse me. And this is hard to file one before the bill is passed, but we filed it on March 15th of 2021. And recently we were granted a hearing. Judge Hendricks heard the motions of the plaintiffs dealing with asking the court to find the law unconstitutional and grant a preliminary injunction, and the defendants who asked that our case be dismissed. The judge was extremely knowledgeable. He listened to both sides, asked penetrating questions of both sides, and we're waiting on his decision. Pete was involved in presenting arguments on behalf of the veterinarians and did an excellent job. We're hoping that soon we'll hear something from the judge. We don't know when that may happen, but the judge does fully understand and made note of that during the hearing, that July 1 was fast approaching and that he recognized that he needed to do something quickly as possible. So we'll keep our fingers crossed that he does do something quickly and that it's in our favor. With that, I'll turn the mic over to Ed Martin and get Ed's perspective on this new law.
Everybody hear me? Can everybody hear me in the back? Okay. First, I'd like to thank the National HBPA for asking me to come here. Everybody, I spend my days these days on the phone answering the same question. What will HISA do? And the answer is anybody's guess. And the fact that I'm saying that should be troubling to everybody. July 1st, the racetrack safety rules take effect. They've told us publicly that July 1st, the doping medication rules are going to take effect. They have a cost allocation formula that's pending at the FTC. started interacting with the HISA folks and the USADA folks, because this is a very complicated implementation and transition. The ARCI as an entity has not taken a position on the lawsuits, and we'll get into the weeds on that momentarily. I have to time myself so I don't run off schedule, but Eric will kill me. You know, the state racing commissions are not going anywhere. State racing commissions are a given, although the role of the state racing commissions may evolve as this bill gets implemented. The states historically, in the regulation of gaming or gambling, whether it be bingo, pull tabs, casinos, racing, sports betting now, it's done as a consumer protection to make sure that what's being done is done on the up and up, and the consumers, the bettors, can have a degree of confidence in the thing that they are being permitted to wager on. So, the state racing commissions are not part of the racing industry. They work for the public. And that's an important distinction to understand as this all plays out. HISA started late. The nominating committee took its sweet time to pick a group of individuals, and many of them I know, many of them you know. A lot of quality people on that board. There's some novices on that board. But to pick the board that they picked, they didn't need to kill four months and run around with PR press releases calling it a gold level, getting the best of the best. We were asked to nominate to suggest some individuals by one of the main organizations. And I suggested some people who are very well respected, including people with regulatory backgrounds who actually supported federal legislation. Not one of the people that we suggested nobody took the time to bother to even speak with me. So that kind of, in hindsight, says that the selection process of the board members itself may have been kind of already decided before they went through the charade. But you're on a tight timetable to implement a major program. You don't have 4 or 5 months to do a public dance as to who should go on the board. So we lost valuable time. Then we lost valuable time in getting somebody to run it on an interim basis. And we've just got the permanent executive director has just started, Lisa Lazarus, and I've had 2 Zoom calls with her. I like her. I like Charlie Shearer, the chairman. I think these are very high-quality people. Lisa's probably walked into more of a chaotic situation than I think she might have anticipated. But our job is we don't make laws, we implement them and we enforce them. And our bottom line here is we don't want to see this turn into a mess. And that may be way beyond our control, certainly is. We thought there was going to be, USADA was going to be an enforcement agency. For some reason unknown, that thing fell apart. I've had people tell me there's probably a 1 in 5 chance that Humpty Dumpty could be put back together. I don't know. I mean, I really don't know. I understand there might be a battle or a disagreement between using a truly independent model, which is where you have an independent entity deciding who tests, enforcing things, and so forth. That's the USADA model. It's also the Racing Commission model, the state racing independent entity. The other model is where the league or the federation, like the NFL, controls who gets tested, whether it's in the public domain. And I understand that there may be a disagreement going on behind the scenes on that issue, and there certainly is a major NFL involvement in the implementation of the HISA. The chair of the anti-doping committee, Adolfo Birch, who I've never had the opportunity to meet or speak with, is the general counsel of the Tennessee Titans. He used to run the NFL's anti-doping program, which is very different than the thing that's run by USADA and run by the state racing commissions, where you have transparency. Things are done out in the open. You try to go to the NFL and try to find out any information about their anti-doping program, you can't find it. You don't know how many athletes are tested. You don't know what they're finding. You don't know what they're doing. Unless all of a sudden, there's an embarrassment, they put a press release out. If you go to the USADA website, you can see how many tests they do. You can see what they're finding. You go to the state racing commissions, you can find out how many tests they do and what they're finding, and if somebody is brought up on a charge, it's a public document. There's a transparency in it. So there's no enforcement agency right now, and they unilaterally decided that they're not going to implement that portion of their program until January 1st. They did not consult with the state racing commissions prior to that announcement, and that kind of rubbed some people the wrong way. Because when you're doing a transition like this, communication and coordination is absolutely key. Especially when you consider everybody has told us they'd like to keep as much of the state infrastructure, where you collect samples, you contract with the labs, you investigate violations, you prosecute violations, and you adjudicate violations. They'd like to keep a lot of that in place because, frankly, that is already paid for. But our esteemed leaders in Washington decided to pass a bill, and let's talk about the sponsors of the people who wrote the bill. They said we modeled this after FINRA, the Financial Industry Self-Regulatory Authority. Anybody who's a financial consultant has to operate under that. They kind of already know how intrusive and controlling that is. But the difference between FINRA and HISA is HISA can't make the states do anything. So on July 1st, the states don't have to drug test anymore. The states don't have to enforce anything that the HISA has included in their rules. Now, do I think the states are going to stop drug testing? Look, the states are going to do the right thing. But a lot of people are scratching their heads on where do you get off not complying with the way the statute is written? Again, we're going to be cooperative to try to avoid the mess. And we would hope that with Ms. Lazarus now running the HISA, that we're going to have a kind of a new start, that some of the way that the authorities conducted itself in terms of behind closed doors, not even letting the regulatory their colleague, partner regulators even observe their committee meetings. And my God, we do our model rules meeting in public. If any of you in this room want to show up, and some of you have come up and speak, you're allowed to. We don't do it behind closed doors because you're making public policy. And we think that the HISA should revisit their policies as to whether they do things in public and in a transparent way. And we're hopeful that they might. When we started meeting with HISA and USADA last August on a state-by-state basis, we had private coordinating meetings because it was important for HISA to understand the legal and budgetary limitations that the state racing commissions operate under so that they could determine how to put their program together dealing with the reality of life. It's complicated and every state is different. It's not a question of whether a state wants to cooperate or not cooperate, or are you on our side or not on our side. That crap has got to stop. Just for the good of the industry. The bad thing that they did with this bill, they had the majority leader of the U.S. Senate and the Speaker of the House of Representatives as the main sponsors of this bill. They attached it to a must-piece pass of legislation. That COVID relief package that ended at the end of 2019. I think it was a $1.5 trillion budget. I worked on Capitol Hill for 10 years of my life. When we saw a bill like that coming down, you know what we called it? We called it a Christmas tree. It means everybody was going to vote for it. So if you had some pet little thing you wanted to slip onto it, we called those ornaments. HISA was an ornament on a Christmas tree that was throwing money out the window. And the people who stood up, well, we're going to do this for horse racing, didn't think to give horse racing a dime. There wasn't one dime for this industry put in by Mitch McConnell or any of the other supporters of this bill. And the bill lets the states walk away. And the challenge is, how much of the existing public investment can you save? And I've advised HISA, as recently as last Friday, that the most important thing the states need right now is certainty, because that's the same thing you need. They're doing budgets. They're trying to understand who's doing what in their individual states, and whether they're going to do it for free, or whether they're going to ask HISA to reimburse them for the cost of some of their employees. And the first bills are going to go out soon. And the states have to decide, I think by May 1st, whether they're going to pay the bill or not. And if they don't pay the bill is going to go to the racetracks in the state. And the racetracks are going to have to figure out how to pay. And nobody knows what the budget is yet. I've tried like hell to try to figure out, is this going to be a 20 million? 30 million, 50 million, 100, what's it going to be? Now, I know what it's going to cost on a per $1 million basis to each state, because that's in their FTC file. But do you times that by 30 or 50 or 100? What do you do? And a lot of people talked about a per start fee. Well, depending on what the budget is, the per start fee could be enormous. Hopefully not. Then what does a racetrack do? How are they going to go to the takeout? They kind of left it at the racetrack. I don't know if they can legally. That's another story. But this is a there's a lot of unanswered questions, and I think HISA needs to kind of open up their thinking. And the other thing this industry can't, I'll wait till questions later, but I've said my point. I'm going to shut up because I've got some really good co-speakers up there.
Okay, Ed. I appreciate also the analysis that the ARCI did at the beginning when this act first came out, wherein you said we don't need to burn a house down to fix the kitchen. I thought that was classic.
Well, what I found really interesting is a lot of people have talked to me over the months, including major proponents of the bill, who had spent the past 10 years talking about how terrible the state racing commissions are. And what a bunch of bozo jobs we've been doing. And look, we don't have a PR firm. We don't have lobbyists. We don't have anybody out there. We just do our jobs. And when all of a sudden some of these people who helped put this together are saying, hey, they really do a pretty good job on the post-race testing and this and that's like, well, why did you dismantle, or why did you create the possibility to just totally dismantle the whole thing? And when you go to a state budget director, or you go into a state that believes in privatization, and you just gave them a way to get out of doing this, they're gonna grab it. So now you got to go to your state capitals and lobby to keep the state racing commissions in the equation. But the state racing commissions, they want to be helpful. The people who are on the state racing commissions care about the industry. But they answer to governors. They answer to legislators. They answer to the bean counters in the budget divisions. They have limited authority. They don't have unilateral authority to tax people. You're going to ask state legislators who are up for election to give a racing commission a blank check to tax people? It's an election year. People aren't going to do that. Even in a non-election year, you're saying, what? Well, wait a minute. The federal government gave HISA the unlimited taxing authority. What's interesting is they also put limitations on HISA's budget. The first budget has to, the subsequent budgets have to be can't be a certain amount over it. Well, the first budget that's coming out is not going to have the anti-doping stuff in it. That's the biggest expense of a state racing commission. And that's going to be known later this year. We don't even know if there's going to be an RFP for a new enforcement agency. You would think you would have one already out there. There's not too many groups that are going to meet the qualifications in the statute to qualify to take USADA's place. So, want me to answer the question, what's going to happen? I don't know.
Thank you, Ed. Now, after Ed has covered the waterfront, Pete, go turn it over to you.
Okay. It's a pleasure and a privilege to be with you today. As Peter said, my name is Pete Sacopulos. I practice law in Indiana and Illinois. I represent people in front of state agencies and regulators. And my role in this discussion today is, as he mentioned, I represent the North American Association of Racetrack Veterinarians. My client has written an amicus brief, which is translated as a friend of the court. We are in support of the HBPA's constitutional challenge to HISA. And our amicus brief was written and filed and argued before the U.S. District Court of the Northern District of Texas on the 16th of last month. And we're anxiously awaiting a ruling. Just by way of background, in addition to my client filing such a brief, the American Quarter Horse Association has also filed an amicus brief in support of the HBPA's position. And on the opposite side, Senator McConnell had a brief written and submitted. I think it would be maybe some interesting to all of you. Both the American Quarter Horse Association and NARD presented at the argument before the federal court. Senator McConnell failed to show up. I don't think that was overseen by that. It was not lost on the court at all. So my perspective is a bit different here. I represent racetrack veterinarians who will become covered persons. We're going to stop referring to people as licensees. We'll begin referring to them as covered persons. In terms of this legislation, it is problematic on a number of fronts. I think where I'm going to focus on the constitutional challenges that we've advanced and how particularly it is of concern to my clients who are veterinarians and should be concerned to all of you who are licensees and will be covered persons under this new legislation. Trying to get a national rule or law to govern horse racing is not something new. I think that in terms of what I'm reading, is it was somehow Senator McConnell came up with this idea and now we have it, and that is not at all accurate. This dates back to 2011 when then Senator Udall, who was a Democrat from New Mexico, had proposed national legislation. It was followed by Representatives Barr and Tonko. Representative Barr is a Republican from Kentucky, and Representative Tonko, a Democrat from New York, proposed what became the Barr-Tonko proposal. And it finally got traction in 2020 when Senator McConnell introduced it on the Senate side, when Representatives Barr and Tonko introduced it on the House side. So it is not something new. What's new is the approach in having it overseen by the FTC and having this authority. And that is where the problem really comes down. In terms of who are the players, we have a whole host of players, and I rather than try to go through a presentation here with you, I will just tell you, we have a lot of HBPA participants in this. We have Arizona, Arkansas, Indiana, Illinois, Louisiana, Mountaineer, Nebraska, Oklahoma, Oregon, Pennsylvania, Tampa Bay, Washington, all have joined in support of this suit. And most recently, the day after the argument in Texas, the state of Texas and the Texas Horse Racing Association also joined in support. On the opposite side, we have the FTC, the authority, and Senator McConnell. So those are the players. So next, what are the constitutional challenges? The challenges that have been put forth really fall into four categories. The first is the non-delegation doctrine. The non-delegation doctrine in our Constitution says that Congress is the branch that makes the government, or makes the laws. So we cannot have Congress delegating the power to make laws to some private entity, and that is what has occurred here. The authority is basically operating as a private entity and making these rules and regulations subject to modification, but not thumb up or thumb down from the FTC, which is very significant. The second is the appointment clause. Who appointed the FTC, or who appointed the authority? And in this case, we had a private individual or private entity appointing its own people. That runs afoul of the appointment clause under our Constitution, which says if you're dealing with an agency, the executive branch of our government should be making those appointments. The third is that it violates the anti-commandeering provision in our Constitution, which says that the federal government should not move in and commandeer or take over state-run agencies and authorities. And in this case, that is largely what's happening, because in terms of HISA, what we have is, first of all, we all need to realize it's dealing only with thoroughbreds at this point, although it may be expanded, and it's dealing with only two major areas, but two major areas. One is medication and anti-doping, and the other is racetrack safety. So it has come in and taken that away, and that is run afoul of the anti-commandeering provision in our Constitution. And then finally, the due process argument, which was what I was asked to advance on behalf of NARV and in support of the HBPA's position at the oral argument that just took place. In terms of covered persons under the Act, which all of you will be, all of my clients will be, I think we need to understand why, from a due process standpoint, this federal legislation is extremely problematic. And that is probably best in terms of an example shown by how the disciplinary process works. As we all know now, under state rules, you have most states, everyone is slightly different, but most of them have an administrative and judicial combination of what happens if you're accused of a violation. You begin with a hearing sometimes before the stewards, and then you go before an administrative law judge. If the person who has been accused of a violation is dissatisfied, they have an opportunity typically to be heard by the commission. And then at that point, the administrative process, this is very general, comes to a stop, and they have an opportunity to be heard in the court of law by way of seeking a judicial review of the decision. That process is going to be very, very different under HISA, and it's something that all of you should take note of, because it will make a major league departure from where we have been. And that is that it's a covered person. You are accused of having a problem under HISA. You're going to start with a review by the authority. And if the authority investigates and finds that there is reason to move forward with filing a charge, they will file that charge, and then you will get an ALJ. And that ALJ is not somebody you have any input on who you get. It is an ALJ that is appointed by the Federal Trade Commission. So we have the covered person and the authority. And you have one side selecting the judge. You have one side appointing the judge. You have one side paying for the judge. You have one side retaining the judge. This is really an unprecedented type of system, and one that is very, very unfair. But it becomes worse as it goes up the chain. And let me explain to you why. If that administrative law judge hears your case, or hears your member's case, and finds that there is a violation, he or she will issue what's called findings of fact, conclusions of law, and a recommended penalty. The administrative law judge then, if you want to take an appeal, or what is referred to as a request for review under HISA, you have an opportunity to do that. But the FTC, which would be operating here, has no requirement to hear the case. They can decide they are not going to review the case at all, at which point then your next stop is the U.S. Court of Appeals. And let me tell you, U.S. Court of Appeals, on average, the cost to arrive at the U.S. Court of Appeals and argue a case is $20,000 to $50,000. Let me also tell you logistically how that happens. This isn't a case where if you want to appeal, you're going to go 10 miles down the road to the State House, or 25 miles down the road to the state regulatory agency to be heard, or to wherever the state commissioners are. Take, for example, the track in Puerto Rico. You have somebody there who's got a problem and the FTC won't take that appeal, won't take that request for review. That covered person, that trainer now is going to Boston to be heard for the first time in the court of law at a cost of $25,000 to $50,000. So this is a radical departure from the state system we have. I think that is really something that we have been working to, and that was what we were trying to explain to the Judge Hendricks when we were in Lubbock. Because due process is the right to be heard in a meaningful way within a meaningful time. And to ask somebody to do that, what you have done is created a cost barrier that most people simply can't pay. So from my client's standpoint, this is problematic from the standpoint that there is no guaranteed right to review, that you've created a price tag or ticket that the average person cannot pay for to get into the Court of Appeals to be heard. And that also, every one of these violations is now a federal violation. So however minor it might be, it's reported to the state licensing agency, and these veterinarians now have a federal report of a violation, which could bring into account not only their license to practice on the backside of the track, but to practice veterinary science in general. So it's a livelihood question. So all of that having been said, where are we now? And I think as Peter said, we have two paralleling lawsuits. One is in Kentucky in federal court, and one is in Texas. And the one in Texas, we're awaiting an outcome. I think whichever side, whether it's the FTC and the authority comes out with a disfavorable decision, or whether we come out with a disfavorable decision, that decision will certainly be appealed, and it will be appealed to the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, which sits in New Orleans. If we are successful, there's no guarantee, but the expectation would be HISA would be placed basically in an enjoined position until the appeal would be heard, and everything would be on hold. So with that having been said, I want to allow time for my colleague, Mr. Kannady, here to address you. So if there's any questions, I'm glad to answer any questions you all have at the conclusion of this presentation. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Pete. And before Chris takes over, one point I want to raise is that during the hearing that was held in Lubbock, the American Court of Lawyers Association was represented by Attorney Autumn Flores, and she did an excellent job in distinguishing how the FINRA, which the FTC is relied upon, or that was relied upon heavily in the arguments to say this wasn't a non-constitutional delegation, how that was distinguished from this situation, and how this situation of this truly being a private entity, how it just flies in the face of the Constitution. With that, I'll let Chris take over and clean up here.
All right, well, thank you. First off, I'm glad that we have finally adopted HISA instead of HISA. It's the leaning tower of Pisa, not HISA. And it gives that connotation of a snake in the grass, which is what it is. I mean, you've got a situation, Ed mentioned it, you've got a 6,000-page COVID bill that this gets bootstrapped in, and here we are. So I don't want to be redundant, and I want to be succinct in my comments, because I want to leave time for questions, and we are running out of time. I'm going to tell you why this isn't going to happen. We go to each and every one of the state legislators, I don't care, legislatures, I don't care if you're Republican or Democrat, who is going to pay for this? So you look at where I'm at now, I will go back to the legislature tomorrow, and we are in session from February until May. This is supposed to go into effect this summer, okay? So usually what happens with the federal government is the federal government shows up and says, we want you to do this federal program, but here's what we're going to do. We're going to do a 10-to-1 match. We will give you 10 times what you put in the program. What they're wanting to do is come into the states, and as been pointed out, which violates the law, and say, here's our program, you go pay for it. So in Oklahoma, the Horse Racing Commission is not appropriated, and I know it's a mixed bag around the country. But there is no way now state legislators are going to hand over a bunch of money, which, by the way, most states are balanced budget states. We can't put money in states, you all know that. And then we're going to give this money to the federal government to run a federal program. It is never going to happen. It is destined for failure. There is no way anybody, and it was pointed out, this is an election year. So we're going to go in and we're going to tax people to fund a federal program. It's not going to work. And so when it comes down the pike and we look at how we're going to pay for it, and and then the horse racing commissions are going to go to the state legislature and ask for that money. They know what the answer is going to be, so then it falls back in their lap. Well, who do they represent? They represent the horsemen. And who's going to be taxed? Them and the tracks. And then you have the other anomaly that we have in the state of Oklahoma. Who owns the tracks? The tribes. Yet another sovereign. You think they're going to have a say in who's going to be paying foot the bill? You think they're going to want to pitch in and foot the bill? No. And only that, it's the whole no taxation without representation, right? So it's all about hitting the little guy. If you're going to tax it based upon how many starts you have in the state, we can compare different states. Well, it's the smaller states, they're going to get the biggest brunt of this. So, from my perspective, it's destined for failure. We aren't going to pay for it. We in Oklahoma, for instance, have not seen a proposal, as Ed pointed out, how much this is going to cost. Forget the fact whether we're going to give them the money or not. And forget the fact of how much money we have to pay. You know, in the state of Oklahoma, we run an $8 billion budget, which is a lot of money. But in this bill, $1.3 trillion went back into the coffers for other programs with not a dime going in to fund this program. Even if we wanted to do it as a state, which we don't, we can't afford it. So it's destined for failure. It's a charade. And we're going to find out when the deadline comes if the court doesn't stop it. I frankly believe we're just playing a game of chicken here. And what fascinates me, because I've done several of these panels, is the lack of response. Yes, there's been no involvement from the whole David and Goliath mentality. But it's almost like that Clint Eastwood thing, if you remember, where he was talking to the empty chair. That's what I feel like I'm doing when I could come up here and sit. Because we form these panels, and then I'm on a panel with a bunch of people who agree with me. Well, that's no fun. I like to argue with people, right? So, but when you go to law school, which, by the way, Ed asked me when I was sitting up here, were you a lawyer? And I was like, it depends on what you're about to ask me next. But I will point out that the three lawyers get to talk less than you, so we get a bad rap sometime, but you're going to have four for the most amount of time. But when you go to law school, one of the things you do is moot court. And they tell you a case, and they say, you've got to figure out how to argue both sides of this. Because when you get called in the room, we're going to tell you which side you're going to argue. And I have no idea how I could walk into a room and try to argue why HISA is good for anybody. Good for the federal government, good for state governments, good for the horsemen, good for the tracks. It's all about local control. We on the local level care more, can do it better, and can do it cheaper. So why the hell would we want the federal government to step in with their overreach and take over a program? Which, by the way, can you give me any example where the federal government's done anything good in the past few years? Politicians have bad approval ratings, I get it, right? But the worst is in Washington, D.C., because people don't trust the federal government. Because they're putting their hands in a pot, and they don't care. We care what happens in the local level. And that's why this is going to fail. But in the meantime, we're going to sit up here, we're going to do what we're going to do, we're going to beat the hell out of it, we're going to talk about it, and then we're going to laugh about it when it does fail. So I will shut up now, because I know we only have a few minutes left for questions.
Thank you, Chris. Okay, I guess we can open it up for questions. If you have anyone with questions, you raise your hand, we'll go to the microphone to you.
I'm Bill Walmsley, and I'm president of the Arkansas HBPA. And my business partner and my racehorse ownership partner is Mark Lambert, Ed, who you know very well, a former chairman of ARCI. It strikes me as something as a lawyer that I would enjoy making the argument. I'd like you to tell me why it wouldn't work. Between July 1 of 2022 and December 31 of 2022, if I have a client who has a positive on a medication or a drug, and I appear before the Arkansas Racing Commission, which is what would happen now. I make the argument that under the supremacy clause of the United States Constitution, the HISA legislation takes precedence over any state legislation that created and authorized our state racing commission to take action. And there are no HISA rules and regulations on anti-doping and medication. Why can't I argue that the case has to be dismissed and there be no prosecutions for drug violations between July 1 and December 31? Is that right or wrong?
Sure, I think I just flipped a coin on this. I mean, you're exactly right, Judge. You can't enforce what doesn't exist. And then if the enforcement doesn't exist and the enforcement mechanism, right? So we're going back to who's paying for it. So during that period of time, we're going to have horse racing commissions saying, we don't have any money to pay for this. And the legislature is saying, there's no way we're paying for it. So you have an issue of not only having the rules to enforce, but as well as who has jurisdiction. The jurisdiction is in limbo. So, yes, you have a supremacy clause argument, but if HISA is not in place and funded, then there is no jurisdiction. It's similar to what we have in Oklahoma right now, and it's very popular in my state, the McGirt decision. A lot of you may not know what McGirt is, but we're in flux right now because we have now went back to say that there are treaties in place with the tribes. So all these people who commit crimes, even murders, we don't have the ability to prosecute them. So then it goes back to the federal government and the tribes. So we have people running around that are going unprosecuted because we can't figure out the jurisdiction. It's the same case here. So you don't have the money to do it, you don't have the rules to do it, and you don't have the jurisdiction, the mechanism to enforce it.
So it's entirely possible that you could commit what would have been a violation of the state regulations on medication or doping and walk away in that 6-month period of time. Is that right?
If the federal government, as you stated with the supremacy clause, has taken jurisdiction over it, similar to what I just stated with McGirt and the tribes, and the state becomes powerless because of the supremacy clause, and we can't go back to our rules and regulations? Yes, because the only thing it falls back on is the federal government. Unless HISA is in place in order to adjudicate these matters, there's no jurisdiction left to take care of the issues.
Finally, on the point you have about funding, I spent 12 years in the Arkansas Senate in the distant past, and Arkansas, as in many states, the Racing Commission is what we call a special revenue agency. It's not funded by general tax revenue. It's funded by funds that come from within the industry itself. And so legislators, myself as one, they generally don't care except for the fact that what we said is don't ask for any general revenue dollars. So I submit that if there is any funding for HISA, it will have to come from participants of the industry. It will have to come from owners, trainers, and franchise holders, because the states will not appropriate general tax revenues to finance this activity, in my opinion.
Yeah, so when we look at budgets, one of the things that we as legislators appreciate, we call them non-appropriated. But they're on a completely different sheet of music, and we only pay attention to it because we don't have to put any money in those coffers. And the argument that's going to be made if we have this is, number one, if we have to give money to the Oklahoma Horse Racing Commission, we're growing government, and we're doing it at the expense of the state taxpayers to grow federal government. And that dog's just not going to hunt from a policy perspective or a political perspective.
Thank you.
So while we're waiting on the next question, I know a lot of times this topic has become extremely litigious, and with 3 attorneys and pretty much a politician on the end down there. I just want to speak to everybody else like me in the room. There was a pretty prominent author in one of the trade magazines who said, you know, and I don't want to quote him, but this is pretty close in paraphrasing, you know, go out on the backside and any horseman, you ask them if they care about constitutionality. That's a big word for is it legal or is it illegal? You know, so there's a lot to be said when we get into the weeds of this discussion. It, to be honest, goes way over my head. But is it legal or is it illegal? I've maintained from the very beginning, I don't have any problem, nobody in the HBPA has any problem with national uniformity based on science. Nothing. Do we have a problem with something being illegal? Hell yeah, we do. And the purpose of this lawsuit, if nothing else, people understand that I felt passionately about finding out if this is legal or not legal. For some of the reasons that Judge Wamsley mentioned, if all of a sudden HISA is in play, and we have some of the scandals that are in the industry now, and you get some high-powered lawyers, and they prove that it's unconstitutional or it's illegal at that point, they walk away scot-free. So we have to do our due diligence now, as a horseman's representative, to make sure this is legal. And if it's legal, you know, eventually when it gets through the court systems, we'll figure out what to do. But we're going to make sure this thing is legal. And you get caught up, you'll hear a lot of people, oh, we need a governing body, we got to be like the NFL, we need a commissioner. There's 32 teams in the NFL. We might have 32 owners in one race day. Good luck with that. And the other thing that completely gets missed over and over, what we deal with, yes, we call them rules, but it's a law. State statute, regulations, it's a law. I officiate high school football. When I throw a flag, I can't put somebody in jail. That's a rule. 10 yards, rules of the game. It's not a law. People seem to forget that, don't know that, or don't care, or want to mask everybody and say, oh, this is the right thing to do. Let's prove it. Let's prove it. You know, constantly I'm battered about, including this podcast member I said earlier, well, what's your solution? Deep breath. Because I have offered solutions until I'm blue in the face. And solutions don't necessarily end with federal legislation. Nobody's jumped up and down and ever said we would not have federal legislation. Nobody said that. This method, what's written now, we don't think it's legal. I don't think it's legal. But if we have the rules in place and they're put there by science, hey, that's part of the solution. You know? Isn't finding a solution asking the question? Tell us why you're banning laces. Certainly not scientific. Certainly, you can point towards the international world, but that's not science. I've written a white paper on putting all of the national uniformity in laboratories under the Department of Agriculture. Talked a little bit about it last night. Gave it to Senator Feinstein during the Santa Anita tragedies. You know, we have this organization that many of you are familiar with called the National Veterinary Services Laboratory. There's your uniformity under the Department of Agriculture. I sat down and worked it out with Dr. Andy Roberts. So there's a lot of solutions that have been put out on the table, and those of you who read the vast majority of the media, you're not going to get that. But you know in this room, and I want you to go out and tell the rest of your affiliate members and board members, I am working my ass off to find solutions. They may not get out in the press. I don't have the massive PR that everybody else does. But we're trying very hard to find a solution. This act is not the solution. Pat.
Question I wanted to direct, Pat Cummings, Thoroughbred ID Foundation. Question I wanted to direct to Ed. I've written a little bit about the lack of transparency and the lack of communication and how frustrating that is for everybody, but in terms of the chaos that you described, and I think that a lot of people feel, do you believe that the chaos is a strategy to bring this forward up until a deadline that can't be passed? Is this somewhat intentional on the part of the organization, on the part of the authority, and how it's gotten to this point? Thanks.
What's the stock market going to do tomorrow? I have no idea, man. All I know is I think in some ways they've made it harder on themselves. I don't know who has advised them politically. They seem to have an army of lawyers. They wanted me to sign a non-disclosure agreement on a draft set of rules that would prohibit me from discussing it with my members. I mean, I work for my members. They pay my salary. That's a kind of an unrealistic ask. You know, I work for people. Everybody works for people. I don't know. It's kind of my personal hope that there will be a court ruling that will force everybody to reassess what it is you're trying to accomplish. And, you know, I go to these meetings and, you know, people in this room have not agreed with some of the things that RCI has done or advocated or thrown on the table over the years. And we respect each other at the end of the day. We all want the same thing. We want safe horses, we want honest races, and we want a healthy sport. This sport right now, we've just gone in like a year from 1.6% inflation to upwards of 9%. The price of oil closed yesterday at $110 a barrel. We went from energy independent to energy dependent again. That is the prognosis on inflation and the costs of doing business, regardless of your business, are enormous. That's coming, and then we're going to tack HISA on top of it. Somebody's got to pull the camera back. And I don't think you're going to get the disagreeing parties who all want the same thing in the room. Lock them in a room and you're not coming out till you figure out how to rewrite this bill. And do it in a way that everybody can live with. But you're not going to get to that until you get a court decision. And, you know, my members were asking them last August, what is your contingency plan if you don't have USANA? And we don't have one. I mean, states were being told that last August. And so I can't read these.
I'll just say briefly that sometimes in politics things are created to fail.
I'd like to add that in terms of the confusion, I don't know how much of it is inadvertent and how much of it is intended. But when you're asked to comment on a large document, and the document is being issued time and again, and requests time and again for red line versions are ignored or not responded to. When we were in Tucson, Arizona at a conference, we asked directly for a red line version. To this day, we've never gotten a red line version. It just creates a lot more work. And, you know, supposedly we're all supposed to be working together in some form. In terms of the confusion, yes, I believe there has been confusion, and I believe part of that has been intentional. But the other point that was brought up, I think is important for all of us here, is I firmly believe that our arguments have a lot of merit. And I firmly believe that that there is a strong chance we're going to get a favorable ruling on this. But then the question is, what's next? And I think collectively we need to know what our next move is going to be. What is our proposal for resolution? Whether that's a compact or where we're going next. Because in these types of situations, you always need to be thinking ahead. And that's something that I think all of us need to do collectively.
Any other questions?
Does anybody else have any other questions? May I make an icebreaker potentially? This is for you, Chris. My name's Chris as well. I grew up since kindergarten with a gentleman who graduated from Harvard with honors, and we still debate. So you mentioned that people don't like to argue with you. I would suggest maybe debate, because it looks like you could pick up a 20-hand horse with ease. So the argument statement, debating might be better. Tough crowd. Sorry.
You can put lipstick on that pig, I'm fine.
I do want to mention something that, Ed, in the current time mentioned, now with the litigation, everyone getting in a room. But I want to remind Ed and everyone in this room, make you aware if you're not aware, and I believe the year was 2017 when Mark Lambert was the ARCI chairman, that happened. President Gessman was in the room, Dave Basler was in the room, I was in the room, and there was, I believe, almost every racing commission represented, not only commissions, the AQHA was there, AAEP was there, we were there, the THA was there. And essentially we had a little bit of a roll call vote. There was one person in the room that voted to move forward with the act, as it were. One person. And again, it goes back to my statement in the beginning in my rambling, when does majority not win? Okay? That's what we're trying to push for here, is understanding what the problem is, certainly wanting to find solutions, that's a must, but how we get there is difficult.
I just want to, that was the closed door president's meeting we had of all the major stakeholder groups in horse racing. And we invited the president of every group and their chief executive officer. And everybody came, except the Jockey Club sent a staff member. And that, we were happy he was there, but, I worked for 10 years in the U.S. Senate, and I've never seen in those 10 years, industries would come before Congress and representative, I don't know how it is in the House in Oklahoma, but I would assume it's pretty much the same. An industry comes in the front door of the legislature, and they're usually united. And they have an ask, whatever that ask is. Could be money, could be legislation, could be national group, who knows? But they're united. This industry went into the halls of Congress and paraded around for years talking about how terrible the industry is. We stink. I hate to say it like that, but we stink. I've never seen an industry take their internal gripes and go into the halls of power and try to fight it out there. And then you have good guys and bad guys, and the guy in the podcast is calling you whatever he's calling you. I can't imagine what they call me. And something, I don't care, because I'm working for people who are kind of trying to be above all that. But the legislators look at this industry sometimes, and they got to wonder what the hell is going on. And it's sad.
Any more questions? Okay. Well, one question, one more question.
Keep my mouth shut.
Here's a microphone right here, 1 second.
But I firmly believe that if HISA ends up as chaotic as it started, there may be no racing in the United States of America of thoroughbreds in 2023. That's how critical I think it is. And if it does fall apart, and if we can't go back to a system like we've had in the past, like RCI's led us in the regulatory industry, it's entirely possible in my mind that there will be no prohibition. And that's almost impossible for all of you to believe, I think. But I'm telling you, I don't want to be one to say, I told you so, next January the 1st.
Judge, I think that you raise a really valid point because of the effect that we don't know what the effect is going to be, but sports betting is becoming more prevalent and a real competitor for the gambling dollar. And in that environment, together with the inflationary effects that we're all experiencing, it's not a pretty picture for the industry.
My question is there an effort on is HBPA making an effort to contact the politicians in the Senate and Congress and at the state level to let them know about all these difficulties that we're experiencing?
So there's two sides to that. Obviously, there was the pre-signature where it was signed into law. Still, the answer would be yes. There's a lot of dialogue with us and our team at the Ingram Group in D.C. on the federal level to discuss the issues and concerns that we still have. Now, prior to the bill being signed into law, I think I was up to about 384 meetings before it unfortunately got signed as a very descriptive version from Ed, how it went into law. It was a lot of work went to that point, but then when Senator McConnell came on board, it was what it was. We still continue, but at this point, just keeping in mind, once Congress typically signs a bill or pushes a bill through and it gets a signature from the president, they're done and off on the next course. So we've been dealing mostly directly with the FTC now in our efforts, but also trying to make sure that the particular parties who sponsored the bill are aware of the concerns and the uncertainty that most of us still feel out here. Oh, another question. Yes, sir.
Yes, I'm Terry Westmeyer. I'm from Oklahoma. And what we seem to have here is an unfunded mandate. And I've heard Ed say the federal government gives no money to support this commission. Heard Chris say Oklahoma's not paying for it. And I wonder how the unfunded mandate, or really taxation without representation, feeds into the constitutional challenges that have been made.
I believe that our arguments with respect to the unconstitutionality have been primarily through the delegation of those types of powers to a private entity. So it's sort of encompassed in that argument. And we have pointed out to the judge that the authority has the unfettered right to tax the participants, the covered persons in this industry. While it's not specifically stated, it is stated and it is encompassed in our non-delegation argument.
You know, what's crazy is each state has their own separate law. So Oklahoma is something I haven't mentioned because I don't get too far in the weeds, but I don't even think we could appropriate money to this, even if we wanted to. Because in Oklahoma, we have a thing called special law. So we can't just pass a law to help one specific entity. And I think the fact that this is just focusing on thoroughbreds makes it a special law. So if any taxpayer could come in, even if we want to appropriate money, and probably challenge it, and it would be overturned. So I don't even think Oklahoma can pay for it if we wanted to.
And I think once it becomes right, hopefully it never will, but if it should, then each and every taxpayer that wanted to challenge it would have a right under not having any representation.
Then you also have other states that are funded, but they have no idea what to fund. And then the other argument is that you're telling us that we're going to have to collect all this money and pay it in, but we have nothing in our budget for this. We have no budget for personnel to do this, for equipment to do this, for how to run such a program. So it's problematic, I think, for all states, no matter how they're set up.
Great. Well, thank you very much for a great panel. So we have about 15 minutes until our RSVP awards luncheon. We will have that back in this room, but take some time to visit with our guests here on the side. At noon, we will start the awards presentation and serve lunch. So hopefully, if you RSVP, we'll see you back in here, and we will begin lunch.